A warm welcome to everyone on this Monday afternoon here in Vienna at the Institute for Human Sciences. My name is Ivan Voda. I'm a permanent fellow here at the Institute, and I lead the Europe's Futures project, which is a strategic partnership that we have with the Erste Foundation based in Vienna as well. I have the great pleasure of introducing the panel and the speakers this afternoon. This is part of our Europe's Futures project, and the theme today, as you all know, is Europe's far right on the rise, defending democracy and promoting alternatives. We are very glad that some of our speakers have made a long journey across the European continent from an island off the northwest coast of Europe called the United Kingdom. And I will introduce Zoe Williams first, who's a journalist with The Guardian in the UK and is co-host of a podcast, Another Europe, and co-hosted with our fellow here at the IWM on the Europe's Futures project, Luke Cooper, who is also a senior lecturer at Anglia Ruskin. Professor Ruth Wodak, who is with us here as a senior fellow at the IWM Emeritus at Lancaster University and the University of Vienna, a friend of many of us and a distinguished citizen of Vienna and of Austria. And last but not least, also made a not so long trip from Warsaw, Poland, Rafał Pankowski, who is an associate professor at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw and a deputy editor of Never Again magazine, and he has some flyers for those of you who are interested. Luke, I think, will be taking this away, so without further ado, sorry, and I forget, very importantly, this is co-organized with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and we have the representative from Brussels with us here. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great turnout, and I would like to start by saying thanks to the IWM for hosting this event in this wonderful room. My name is Ada Regelmann. I represent Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Some of you might know Foundation, others might not, so I say a few words about us. We are a political education organization affiliated with the German party Die Linke, the left party, but independently operating, I should say. We are funded by the German parliament, so taxpayers, which brings me to the first important point of my speech, which is that I will pass around a participant list, which I would like to ask you to sign because we need to justify what we're doing to our funders. So, but that's not the most important thing, obviously. So as a political education organisation, we organise events, we fund network events, we sponsor political actors, civil society actors, we issue publications and so on, in a range of issues, among which is the challenge of the rise of the far right, but also many others. We have around 20 offices around the globe. Brussels office is one of them, and I represent Brussels office, and it is Brussels office that collaborates with actors both in Austria and in the UK and about 11 other countries in Western Europe. We were very glad when Another Europe is Possible reached out to us for this collaboration. You approached us with an interest in internationalizing the often parochial debate in the UK on a range of issues, importantly the future of Europe, at a time when much of the rest of Europe stares at the UK in bewilderment, and also with a lot of complacency regarding the issue of Brexit, obviously, as if it had nothing to do with the rest of us. So we believe it is important to have this debate together and to embed the narrow focus of Brexit that we will also discuss in another podcast in a broader discussion about things like the institutional crisis facing the EU, the challenge of towards representative democracy and political participation, centrifugalism and nationalism across the continent and beyond, and much of which actually corresponds with the rise of the far right. I would also like to draw your attention to a small publication of our office, which is now slightly dated because it contains information regarding the last European Parliament, but it contains some interesting information. Over the past 20 years, we've seen in Europe far-right parties get a share in the European Parliament from just about around 10% up to nearly a quarter in the last Parliament, and we're expecting this share to rise in the next election, and also for those parties to consolidate even further. So we are facing a serious challenge, and I'm looking forward to interpretations and importantly answers as to how to challenge that rise. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those introductions, and thanks so many of you for coming to this discussion and conversation today. As you've heard, my name's Luke Cooper. I'm a visiting fellow here at the IWM, and with Zoe Williams from The Guardian, we co-host the Another Europe podcast, which, if you enjoyed today's event, and you might not, of course, you can find on all good podcast platforms. I think it goes without saying, in a way, that part of the interest in this discussion does lie in the fact that European societies are facing a challenge from an insurgent far right, which is really unprecedented in the history of Europe, at least since the Second World War. And we know that this new type of political fascism, and we can discuss this evening the different ways that it's changing, is well financed. It's increasingly transnational, ironically, given the nationalist political coloration of these parties, and its intent in particular of turning the clock backwards on many of the achievements of liberal democratic societies in the post-war era. I'm thinking of minority rights, issues of race and identity, the freedom of minorities, and in some countries also homophobia. So the questions that we're going to be talking about this afternoon is, well, how do we really analyse the causes of this far-right radicalisation? Where is it coming from? And what does it tell us about the societies that we're living in the first place, that this is becoming an issue? And what alternatives are really needed? And is this a sign, in a way, of alternatives already failing, or there not being sufficient alternatives out there? And how can civil society and progressives respond to these issues? As you've heard, we've got a great panel here, and without further ado, I'm going to just ask our initial question of getting our foundation. So maybe I'll go to Rafał first on this one, and looking at, well, who are the far right, and what do they want?
Thanks for the question. Thank you for the invitation. It is really an honor and a pleasure for me to be here in this important institution. The atmosphere of intellectual freedom is very precious. We still do have some enclaves of intellectual freedom in Poland, but generally speaking, the current climate in Poland has really become toxic and very unpleasant on many levels. So it's really good to be here for a change. It's a tricky question, obviously, but I would say it's especially tricky in the current Polish context, because we no longer know what is the far right and what is not the far right, what is the mainstream right. I think it is an important distinction in a democratic society. there is nothing automatically evil about being a conservative or somebody with a right-wing outlook, but clearly the distinction is becoming more and more problematic in the Polish context, where the demarcation line between the sort of normal part of the democratic spectrum, the mainstream right on the one hand, and on like the current ruling party, and on the other hand the extreme anti-democratic nationalist groups like the National Radical Camp, which is a street movement which takes its name from the original fascist group that existed in Poland in the 1930s. Again, the distinction between the rhetoric, the discourse the mainstream right uses and the far right uses is becoming less and less clear. And we have seen it more and more in the last 2 or 3 years, not least in the form of hate speech against various minority groups, that is no longer confined to the far right fringe, but it comes from the political mainstream, including very importantly from the state-owned media, the government-controlled media, that today is one of the main actors that pushes hate speech against minority groups, but also against people they consider as critics or opponents, and such people are routinely labeled as traitors to the nation on the state media. So what we are talking about is really the fundamental issue of the national community, the construction of the national community, who is in, who is out, who belongs, who doesn't belong. And I am afraid the criteria of belonging to the national community currently are the criteria that are present in the mainstream discourse are very similar to the criteria proposed by or promoted by the far right.
And Ruth, you've been prominent, let's say, in recent weeks in Austria, but have obviously written on these questions for a long time. You know, in the Austrian case, what is it exactly that we're dealing with?
If we would know, that would be good. But I believe that the phenomenon in Austria is not that new. And I think it's important to see it a bit in a more historical context. If you think back in Austria, and we've talked a few times about this, basically this rhetoric of exclusion, as you mentioned, and also the issue of who's a real Austrian, this nativism, so it's not just nationalism, but it's a nativist nationalism transferred over blood, which really insinuates National Socialist or fascist ideologies. That started already post-war, because the Austrian Freedom Party, which was the VDU, basically post-war, is the successor party of the NSDAP. So there is, in Austria, the far right draws on that tradition. That doesn't mean that everybody who's in the Freedom Party is a Nazi, but there is this strong ideological tradition which feeds into the Freedom Party to date. And already 1989, when the Iron Curtain fell, Haider sort of started and launched a very strong rhetoric of exclusion at that time against people coming from the former Eastern Bloc countries. So they were white and Christian, so religion wasn't the issue. The issue was they were migrants, and they were defined as threatening us, taking our jobs away. They were different. the whole phenomenon of the young men who were threatening our women was already apparent at that time. And if we then go further along, we have sort of a peak of this Haiderization, 1999, where the Haider Party, the Freedom Party, already had 27% of the votes in a national election. And that was before 9/11. Then we can notice a discursive shift. So from sort of the othering towards people coming from the Eastern Bloc countries, former Eastern Bloc countries, towards excluding Muslims. So that became basically one of the priorities of Strache, who followed Haider as leader of the Austrian Freedom Party. And so we can notice a shift in the sort of rhetoric of exclusion, and suddenly it becomes an issue of religion very strongly. Sort of, we don't want minaret, not me included, yes. We don't want minarets, they are different, so a culturalization of that discourse. And I think then comes the refugee movement, 2015, and the patterns of the rhetoric are very similar to the patterns 1989, just different protagonists. Mm-hmm. So they're Syrians, Iraqis, Afghanis, and so forth. And formerly, 1989, there were Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, Romanians. So, but now it's basically about Muslims coming. But the interesting issue is it's in Austria, and the same is true, I think, in Hungary and Poland and Romania, is that it's connected also to anti-Semitism. So it's not the case that this anti-Muslim sentiments have substituted anti-Semitism in Central Europe. It's connected, and we have this overall Feindbild of Soros, who seems to pull the strings behind everything and is also pulling the strings so that the Muslims come to Hungary and the Mexicans come to the US and whatnot. So this fantasy is apparent, and so you have an argumentation pattern of first there is this lobby of powerful Jews, and then they sort of drive the Muslims, and the Muslims will overtake the white Christian Europe. And that's basically now simplified, but the general argumentation, and that is very strong. It's also in Austria, and I think that's what makes the rhetoric of fear, that we might be overwhelmed by these strangers.
Because when I was thinking about this question, I was wondering, well, is the answer really Sebastian Kurz, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Donald Trump? I mean, in the sense that all of those figures have in common what Rafał was talking about in this way of this blurring of the distinctions. You don't know where you are anymore between mainstream conservatism and traditional far-right politics and fascism. Because if you're in a situation where the President of the United States can call for Muslims to be banned for his country and refer to Mexican and Latin American immigrants as rapists and so on, then something fundamental has happened internal to conservative ideology.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we always talk about the rise of the far right as though it's a failure of the progressive politics to resist it. But actually, the people who show the worst resilience to it are those mainstream conservatives who showed absolutely no resistance, and they seem almost discombobulated by the appearance of the far right. I mean, the Republicans in America are the best example of this. They're complete. They're atrophy. They seem to have a muscular atrophy in the face of Donald Trump because they don't know how to resist him when he's not their classic enemy, but nor can they collapse into him, so they're just frozen in time. And actually exactly the same thing has happened in the UK in terms of kind of mainstream conservatism and the rhetoric of Brexit, which has unearthed a lot of far-right language and a lot of far-right terminology. That there was a classic quote from a conservative minister talking about door knocking among conservative constituencies and saying if you go into a house and there are books on the shelves, basically they're no longer voting conservative. So the kind of civilized right, if you like, the right that listens and the right that reads, has gone completely underground. And I wonder if that's the first moment. I wonder if that's the first line of defence, and the failure of that line of defence is the beginning of a far right movement.
If I may first say something, I think in the Austrian case, the new ÖVP or the ÖVP courts has instrumentalized the far right and the far right agenda in a very strategic way. Basically, the new ÖVP won the election by playing with the anti-immigration card, in a kind of softer rhetoric. Mm-hmm. But basically, that was the main agenda, so that, for example, the Peter Pilz, who's a very well-known politician of Jetzt, the party Jetzt, which is a sort of split off of the Green Party, said Kurz is the better Strache. So basically playing with the agenda of the anti-migration and anti-Muslim brought the victory. So it wasn't the case that they were overwhelmed by the far right. Mm-hmm. They used that, and there's quite an interesting symbiosis, which I also believe to be the case in other countries. As long as you are in power, you don't do anything against the Trumps or similar, because the Republicans could vote or could have also done something against Trump, but they vote with Trump. And in that way, as I think it's also an opportunistic strategic game. As long as you are in power, there are very few who speak up, and that's also the case here in Austria. Even though there are strong voices in the conservative Christian Social Party, and we know that they don't agree, and sometimes they give an interview or they write an op-ed, but basically they play along because the party is in power. And I think one shouldn't neglect that part. So I don't think they are driven by the far right. It's a quite nice symbiosis. It's a win-win situation for both.
But then
now.
Why doesn't that have a cost for them? Why does it only deliver? There should, if you look at the kind of historical arcs, be a huge electoral cost when you abandon the civilized norms of political discourse, but there doesn't seem to be.
Rafał, tell us about the Law and Justice Party in this context, because this is an interesting case for Europe in a way, because it starts as a relatively quote-unquote moderate party. I mean, I know in Hungary we have an even more extreme example of that, as party Fidesz, that starts as a liberal party and then gradually over time moves further and further to the right.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you're right, because this example shows us it's a dynamic picture, and also it shows us that the social norms or the norms of political culture, they shift. So back in the 90s, the then party of the founder of Law and Justice was not even called Law and Justice, it was called the Agreement of the Center, so it wasn't even calling itself right-wing. But then clearly many things have changed, and when Law and Justice was established under the current name in the early 2000s, it was a center-right party with a conservative ideology, but it was very different from its current ideology, and it moved to the right step by step over the years, and eventually it occupied the political space that used to be occupied by another political party called the League of Polish Families, which was the far-right nationalist party that existed in Poland, that was even briefly in the government around the years 2006, 2007. It doesn't really exist anymore, but Law and Justice clearly took over most of the voters, but also much of the ideology of the League of Polish Families. And one important factor here is Radio Maria, that you may have heard about, which is not just a radio station, it's much more than that. It is also a kind of Catholic nationalist social and political movement, which provides an important sort of framework, or a symbolic framework for law and justice politics today. I also wanted to mention the Trump factor, because I think it is relevant to many countries, including Poland. As you may remember, Trump cancelled his visit to the UK in July 2017, but he went to Poland instead. And that was an important event in terms of legitimizing the political direction Poland has taken in the last years. And it was a really interesting case of a long speech he gave in a big square in the center of Warsaw, where he talked about Polish history, and that was interpreted as a kind of acceptance of the Polish nationalist view of Polish history, and it was maybe even more interesting for what didn't happen, or what he didn't say. He didn't refer to democracy, he didn't refer to human rights, and he was the first US president in many decades who didn't visit the monument to the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And that was also noted. And that was also noted as a very positive fact by the Polish far right, that clearly felt further emboldened and empowered by this kind of gesture.
I just wanted to add to this important question, I think, of Zoe about sort of the conservatives and the far right and how they might play together, the populist far right. Just again referring to the Austrian case, I think it's a kind of symbiosis. Yeah? So they both, it's a win-win situation. Yeah? So the far right, which is an anti-establishment party and actually stands for the little man and the little woman of the street, is implementing or is co-implementing policies which are against this electorate. Mm-hmm. So they have to satisfy them and keep them satisfied, and they do that in various ways by keeping the anti-immigration agenda on the news, and also by sort of this nativist agenda and so forth. On the other hand, they get certain issues which are symbolic politics, like there's something against the headscarves in schools, and the burqa was forbidden in the public sphere, and you can smoke again in restaurants, which was Strache's big wish because he's a smoker. And it seems absurd, but these are big issues, symbolic politics. On the other hand, Kurz gets, or the ÖVP gets, the neoliberal agenda, which is implementing suddenly 12-hour working days and 60-hour working weeks without having the trade unions involved, and so-called flexibilization, cutting social benefits, etc., which are directed against the sort of core electorate of the populist far right. So in that way, they play together.
So he wouldn't be able to get his kind of rolling back of the state away if he didn't have these nativist language around it.
Yeah, I think so.
That's interesting.
And so they both get, because they need to keep both electorates somehow happy, and they seem to be doing well in the polls. So I see it a bit really as a very unfortunate, in my view, very unfortunate symbiosis.
Yeah.
And this term has been introduced in the English language world of the Bannon playbook to describe the way in which the new far right, in this blurred way with the traditional right, come out and make a shocking statement in order to seize hold of the news agenda, dominate it for several days, and then shift the terrain of the debate and terrain of the discussions onto their issues. And one thing you saw, I think it was last summer in the UK, is that Boris Johnson was directly in text message communication with Bannon. He's discussing the future of Europe, discussing Brexit, discussing a range of other issues. I mean, this is a political figure who then, when they were the mayor of London, not so long ago now, was, celebrated his multiculturalism and his tolerance and his belief in compassionate conservatism, but then has entered this new political dialogue with the American, far right and others. And, during these, a week or so later after these discussions with Bannon, came out and wrote a very shocking op-ed where he referred to women who were wearing the burqa as letterboxes in this very stupid, silly Boris Johnson, but incredibly offensive way. And I know, Ruth, you've talked about this method, but maybe you could say something about...
Again, Bannon is, I think, looking at the textbook of demagogy, yes, and manipulation, because, again, being provocative and creating scandals to distract from other possibly very hurtful policies is a very well-known means. And I think Bannon and also the FPÖ, Haider was very clever in this, is sort of dominating the news agenda. I called that in my book the perpetuum mobile of the far right. So you constantly provoke a scandal, then everybody has to report it, then it's recontextualized, and somebody says that's not what I meant and not what I said, and it's taken out of context, and then one can claim victimhood because one is sort of, there's a campaign against somebody and so forth, and that wheel is sort of going on, and once one of these provocations has ended, and now there are even no apologies anymore, just, the next provocation comes. And one of the dangers for, I think, sort of traditional quality media is that they don't cut through this Gordian knot, that they don't sort of seize the agenda back and say, okay, actually we want to report about X, Y, Z, and maybe put this on page 12 or something, but not let ourselves be driven constantly by this provocation. And that is obviously what Boris Johnson started doing, and others in the UK. But what has been happening here all the time, so every week we have a so-called, here in Austria, so-called single incident, an Einzelfall. And the single incident is one of many incidents, but each of them are defined as single and exceptional, although they belong into a long narrative. And it's in, something about insinuating something anti-Semitic or Nazi stuff, or saying something unsayable, and so the whole media jumps on it. And so it continues, and while this is happening, all the other policies are being decided upon, usually or now quite frequently in very undemocratic ways. So there's less time in Parliament for expert opinions, there's less discussion, there's less, the question-answer sequences, so it's being hollowed out. But meanwhile, everybody's sort of occupied and involved into these provocative issues.
I mean, to go back for a second to your point about the symbiosis, if we are saying that the mainstream right needs the far right and the far right needs the mainstream right, in order for the mainstream right to get through its economic agenda while the far right gets through its cultural agenda, are we basically saying then this is a function of economic meltdown? That if we were all prospering, none of this would be happening?
Well, I can now speak for Austria, and then Rafał will say something about Poland. In Austria, there there was no big after effects of the economic crisis. It's not comparable to the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, I've lived in Lancaster for 12 years. I've seen the high street going down the drain, shops being closed. Everybody had somebody in their families who became unemployed. That was not the case here. So, you know, unemployment rose a bit and there's a fear of losing out, but people didn't lose out in any way comparable to countries which were really hit by the crisis. So the fear is instrumentalized in a different way.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, actually, what I wanted to say might be very similar. Poland, from what I remember, was the only country in the EU that didn't have a recession in the aftermath of the global crisis. Of course, that doesn't mean that it didn't suffer from certain economic hardship, just like everybody else. But relatively speaking, you might say Poland was lucky if you compare it to other countries like Greece or Latvia or other
Portugal,
places.
Spain,
of course. So of course, you know, when we discuss those issues with some of my friends on the left, some of them would say, no, it's the economy. Stupid, you know, it's about unemployment and issues like that, and when we fix that, there will be no far right anymore. And I think that's not necessarily correct, because I think when we look at the Polish far right that rose dramatically in the last couple of years, I think there are other factors at play. Such as anxiety, but not just on the socio-economic level. There are issues around identity and national identity, and anxieties that are partly artificially created through far-right propaganda, but certainly the socio-economic factors don't seem sufficient by means of explaining the
So I mean,
the
this
rise
is a
of the far
terribly
right.
big and open question, but why is it then? I mean, say that it's not the economy stupid, but what is it? Smart.
You go first.
Okay, thank you. Well, I would say that the identity question is crucial. And I see Ivan Krastev sitting back there. The refugee movement was absolutely a tipping point where the fear was created and then also instrumentalized for the demographic arguments. Yeah? So this fear of being overwhelmed, being invaded by Muslims and our culture, the Occident being destroyed, etc., is an amazing fear. If I can believe what Ivan wrote in his book, which I do, then obviously that has been crucial, at least in Eastern Europe. It's interesting in Austria and also in Switzerland and Denmark, which are all very rich countries, small countries, the identity question became salient, and the national identity in different ways. But all of these countries basically were not hit by the financial crisis. Yeah? So it's not in any way comparable to other countries in Europe. And so I think that in these countries, the welfare chauvinism is so strong. You want to preserve the achievements of the post-war for us. Yeah? So it's basically national socialism. Yeah? So you want to preserve this social welfare, and these are all, Scandinavian models, social welfare countries with still huge benefits, wonderful health care, etc., etc. The Danes are supposed to be the happiest people on earth. I've read some rankings. So to preserve that for us, yeah, and the fear that you would lose that is enormous. And that can be culturalized very easily with who will take that away and they don't belong to us. So I think that there you have a different sort of explanation than in those societies which became very polarized, very different, because Greece became polarized. The far right didn't take over, actually Syriza took over, so it's a very different story. The same in Portugal, you have a social democratic government, it's actually a success story, and a very different story than the countries where the far right is emerging so successfully, and that preserved the social benefits and worked against the austerity politics. Portugal is a very interesting case because you don't have a populist far right. So,
but did they ever have a populist far right?
well, they had fascism.
No, I mean, to generate the social movement we see now, was that sparked? Because in Greece that was certainly sparked by Golden Dawn, but in Portugal,
but Golden Dawn has a long history, and Greece had a civil war post World War II, and the far right has always been strong in Greece. And remember the dictatorship and so forth. Portugal had Salazar and fascism, but since then, conservative and social democratic governments, but not a re-emergence of this far right. Spain now has a re-emergence, which is interesting, but probably due also in instrumentalizing the refugees which are landing in Spain. But Portugal just said no to the EU austerity politics, which is really an interesting issue.
Well, I think there are similarities and differences between countries. One of the things that I believe should be mentioned about Poland is the fact that Poland historically used to be one of the most diverse multicultural nations in the whole of Europe. Today, as a result of World War II, the Holocaust, the border changes, deportations, etc., today Poland is one of the most homogeneous mono-ethnic societies in the whole of Europe, and I think in a way it has not managed to deal with the identity issue that results from those dramatic events in Polish history, and especially in the 20th century. And that is one of the paradoxes why, explaining at least partly why ethnic nationalism is so strong, despite the fact that the minority groups, the Jewish community is so tiny, the Muslim community is very small too, but the levels of both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are relatively high. And I think there is no denying the dramatic impact the year 2015 had also on Poland. And again, paradoxically, despite the fact that the refugee crisis in the south of Europe didn't really impact Poland in any meaningful way, because very, very few of those refugees ever made it to Poland, or were going to go to Poland. But that coincided with the electoral campaign. So we had different right-wing and far-right groups and parties competing on who will be more anti-migrant, anti-refugee, and anti-Muslim. That was also framed, the threat, the supposed threat of refugees arriving in Poland was framed in a very negative way in the media. And the repercussions of that particular moment are still with us. And you see, I had been dealing with the issue of far-right and xenophobia for more than 2 decades. But I wasn't really aware that the level of hate speech and the level of hate crime could be correlated so clearly, so visibly. So we saw the levels of hate speech rose dramatically, and so did the number of hate crimes immediately in the summer of 2015. That is something that we clearly saw, and the repercussions of those weeks are still with us. But we were often told that Islamophobia replaced anti-Semitism as the main type of hate on the Polish right, and I was never sure about it, and I thought it is probably more appropriate to say it supplemented anti-Semitism rather than replaced it, and in a way that was proved correct last year. But then again, I have to admit, I didn't quite imagine, I didn't expect there could be a wave of anti-Semitism in the mainstream of Polish politics and media on that scale. I knew anti-Semitism existed. I knew it was very much alive on the far right in Poland, but I didn't think I would live to see that kind of explosion of anti-Semitic sentiment in the mainstream media and mainstream politics. And of course there was this controversy around the Polish Holocaust memory law that sparked it. But what I thought was even more problematic than this piece of legislation was the kind of discourse that went with it. And I think repercussions will be with us for many more years to come.
I find it interesting that 2015 has been mentioned by both of you. I mean, looking at it from this British perspective, unfortunately, in some ways. But 2015 wasn't such a negative moment in Britain in terms of the immediate impacts of the refugee crisis. Particularly when the young toddler Alan Kurdi died, there was a huge outpouring of the refugee in the Aegean coastline. I think many of you will have seen the image. There was a huge outpouring of sympathy and actually a lot of pressure in the British public sphere and space to match the Merkel offer, in which wasn't realised, and Cameron rejected it and so on. But the pressure was there to say Britain should, open up to the refugee crisis. But they didn't.
No.
So they withstood the pressure. Yeah. And then a year later, it's a tale of 2 years. 2016 happens. We have a referendum campaign around Brexit and the EU, where the refugee question is completely instrumentalised. We had breaking point posters by Nigel Farage. It's often claimed by the mainstream campaign, Vote Leave, Take Back Control, that they didn't engage in this nasty rhetoric, but even though they sent out leaflets to every single house in the UK that said, with a big arrow pointing from Turkey, Britain's new border is with Syria and Iraq, i.e. it's a completely instrumentalised
But I would love to hear a bit more kind of Europe as kind of compared with Britain here, because our political discourse draws no distinction between refugees and migrants. It's they are all foreign, they are all problematic. There's very little distinction drawn between EU migrants and non-EU migrants. Yeah. So, but is that true of Hungary, Poland, Austria? No.
So there's a big distinction between EU people from the EU member states and migrants. And then also sometimes refugees. Yeah? So we have three categories, if you want to say so. They're of course not quite so sharp categories, but basically I was struck when I was living in Britain, and we did a big project at Lancaster University looking at the representation of refugees, migrants and asylum seekers in the British press, including The Guardian, in over 10 years. And it was striking to see how those categories were merged. And you could sort of have in one article, you would have migrant and then refugee and then bogus asylum seeker and then whatnot, and they were all, sort of synonymous, although they're very different. So I was already then struck that in Britain there was no distinction between the migration in the EU, where also many British people live in France and in Spain and travel and do all what everybody else does in Europe, and from outside, and then refugees, which is totally different. And so already then that we looked at the reporting from 1996 to 2006, so 10 years, all British national newspapers. And only the Financial Times didn't merge that. I mean,
Wow,
even
that's
the
shocking.
Guardian
Yeah,
did
yeah,
some
yeah,
of it,
yeah.
but very little.
Yeah.
And if you now look, the discourse has shifted again, and there's again a really huge discursive shift, I would say, because now everybody talks about illegal migrants. Now that is a very interesting category because it doesn't make sense. So if you look at, so you don't distinguish anymore in Austria, for example, so EU migration is one thing, but so you don't distinguish anymore between asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants who come more or less voluntarily.
Right.
And all of them are called illegal migrants. And so this whole discourse about building walls and closing borders, etc., is about keeping illegal migrants out. And I've had a discussion with some lawyers. I wanted to know about the legal definitions of these terms. And illegal migrant, I was told, only makes sense if somebody asked for asylum, applied for asylum, let's say in this country, was rejected and could have been deported back to a safe country. Yeah, so his country, or his or her country of origin would be safe, not Syria or war country in war, and nevertheless stayed and hid or ran away or did something. Only in that case can we speak about illegal migrants. Otherwise, they're applicants, they're refugees, they're migrants, they're asylum seekers. There are many other terms which are legal terms. But that has been completely merged now, and it's very. If you read, for example, the government program of the now Austrian government, you don't find the term refugee anymore. So it's all been substituted by illegal migration. And so that has really sort of been recontextualized and redefined as the new term, although it's completely wrong.
Do you want to ask this question about what do they want, the far right? Because I need to know the answer.
Well, we kind of talked about that at the beginning.
I know, but we you know, as a kind of political vision.
What they want?
What is the country that they want to live in? I mean, you know.
Well, what does peace want?
Well, we all know that the term that has been making rounds in the last years, illiberal democracy. And of course, in some ways that makes sense, but in some other ways maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's an oxymoron. I think in the Polish case, well, this the slogan that we know very well from history, Poland for the Polish, is at the heart of the far right politics. But of course, it assumes a very specific understanding of what it means to be Polish, of who belongs and who does not belong. And in fact, it's not just about ethnicity. It is deeper than that. It is also about ideology. That's why the right-wing propaganda has often referred to critics and opponents as traitors. There is a word in Polish which goes back to the 18th century, the word Targowica. Targowica was a town where a group was formed that called for Russia to intervene. Catherine the Great was asked to intervene in Poland. This term Targowica is the synonym of treason in the Polish language. And this is the term that state television uses every day to describe the political opposition. And I think, well, especially in the last couple of weeks, that has been a really important and painful subject, and especially in the context of the killing of the mayor of Gdańsk, who had been the target of hateful propaganda, including on state television. So once again, we realize it's not just about words, it's not just about symbols. This is the kind of propaganda that could also have a very, very real, very tragic impact on people's lives.
Yeah.
Just also, this not quite going back to Catherine the Great, but Austria First was the slogan of Haider's petition 1992-93. So America First is sort of, again, not new as a slogan. And I think it's very much about this nativist vision of the white Christian Europe, with a very conservative gender politics, where if you read the program of the Austrian Freedom Party, which everybody can download from their website, you see that women should not work outside of house, that there should be no abortion, right? So it's going back for decades. It's like, going back to the 1950s or earlier, and basically going back to nature is part of this vision as well. So the blood and soil imagery comes up, and you can find that as a vision. Plus, then for Austria, it's pan-Germanic vision, and then comes the emphasis on the German language and the German culture, and so forth. So all of that, there is a very clear ideology, and it's very explicit. It's called the Handbook of the Freedom Party Politics, and the preface is written by Strache and Norbert Hofer, who had been the candidate for president 2016. And if you read it, it has all of these issues and values stated very explicitly. So it's really still the white Christian Europe, which is the vision, and everything else doesn't belong here.
Yeah.
I think we should open it up to the audience. I mean, the main thing the far right want in Britain is Brexit. So if you can give us any advice on how to stop that with 6 weeks to go, we'll be very grateful in the questions.
They're not going to stop at Brexit, though. Once they've got Brexit, they'll want something else. They'll want me to go back to doing housework.
That's true. Yeah. We have a mic somewhere, so yeah. Should I go here first?
Rauchenberg, Institute of the Danube region. I've just a short question. What is your opinion about the close relationship of right-wing parties to Moscow, to Russia, especially FPÖ? They have even an agreement with the Russian party close to President Putin. Then you have the financing of Lega Nord, of Marine Le Pen, Front National, from Russia, and it's only different with Poland, as we know. But otherwise, what is your opinion? Thank you.
Take another one. Yeah, Diana. Oh, there's a mic. If you don't have the mic, you don't get on the podcast.
Okay. So in Romania, the far right is very linked to the church, and the church is like the strong arm of the far right movement. And I was curious, like in the other countries, in Austria and in Poland, how potent is the church and how strongly it's connected to these movements? And I also have like a more general question, which is like, why fear? Because fear seems to be the key word. Why is fear so potent and so easy to instrumentalize?
Okay, good. Should we come back with those questions?
Yeah.
Yep. Putin, church, fear.
Right. So Russia first. Well, as you know, Polish history vis-à-vis Russia is complicated, but there is also an important sort of tradition on the Polish far right that's actually pro-Russian, and it still exists. The current government is and the ruling party is very anti-Russian in its sort of official language, but there are some surprising facts about the relationship that may suggest it's again more complex than that. It was interesting to see Mr. Salvini visiting Poland a few weeks ago, and from what was reported about the meeting with the leadership of the Polish ruling party, it looks like they reached an agreement for the European election this year, and they said they agree on 90% of things, they don't agree on 10%, and I think that was probably about the Russian connection. So we will see what happens next. But the question about the church, of course, is very relevant to the Polish case, and the issue of religion is a very important issue vis-à-vis Polish national identity. And I mentioned already Radio Maria as a social movement that is ostensibly a Catholic movement, but I would argue it might be wrong to interpret it in terms of religion. I would argue it's more of a political movement, and it's first and foremost a nationalist movement. To give you an example, Pope Francis is very unpopular among the Polish nationalists who call themselves Roman Catholic, but they hate the Pope. To give you an example, yes, he's too pro-refugee, he's pro-migrant, pro-gay, pro-everything. They don't like that, for sure. And to give you an example, you may find difficult to believe, but it's actually a real example from last year in Krakow. They prayed for the death of the Pope.
No.
And that's. I would say that's an extreme example of disagreeing with the leader of your own church, which shows there is a problem of identity within the Polish Catholic Church. And the Archbishop of Krakow was asked what he thinks about it, and he said he actually invited the priest who did it. He invited him for a conversation, and he told him not to do it in the future. But there was no punishment, so I think there is also a question of discipline and the implosion of hierarchy and authority in the Polish Catholic Church. But we also have pagans who are anti-Christian. And it's a small part of the right-wing spectrum, but it also exists. And they all come together for example, on the 11th of November, which is the annual Independence Day march in Warsaw, where different nationalist groups come together, and they happily march hand in hand, the Catholics, the pagans. So they're united by something else, and that is nationalism, which trumps the different disagreements.
So about Putin, it's interesting. Yeah? Well, it seems that a lot of the ideology or the politics of Russia, and I'm not a political scientist, but what we see matches very well the ideologies of the far right, both on gender politics. So I've already mentioned gender politics is a real issue, and this macho habitus and so forth, the homophobia in Russia. So the Freedom Party in its handbook also is homophobic. Basically the nationalism. So there are many ways how to reach out, and of course the anti-left, anti-communism and so forth, where it's interesting that Putin comes from the KGB originally, but and of course also the aggression and drive against the media. So the managed media and the way the media are suppressed, most of them, at least the official hegemonic media in Russia, is also something which is obviously wanted by the far right in Austria. Yeah, and they have already started, as you know, to launch several sort of attacks against the ORF and some journalists, etc. So there are these connections, and it's interesting now again in this symbiosis, I think, of the conservatives, the pro-European conservatives, where it's well known that Russia actually is against the EU, that they don't do anything against the sort of dialogue and conversation between the far right and Russia. So again, you have sort of this interesting laissez-faire politics there. The church in Austria basically is very much on, especially the NGOs were very much helping the refugees. And so it's, I mean, maybe some parts of the church are also quite conservative, but all in all, the church does not support the far right. Yeah. And then the question about fear. Now, instrumentalizing fear is probably one of sort of the handbook of demagogy, one of the most appealing methods. Yeah, you create fear, you instrumentalize fear, both quite genuine fear, but then also sort of exaggerated, pretended fear, and then you create hope. Yeah, so you will kind of solve that problem, you will take this fear away, you are saving the people, and that is exactly what the Trumps and Le Pens and so forth promise to do. So fear is coupled with the promise of salvation in a also quite religious sense.
Yeah.
A very tiny commentary to your analysis, Ruth. I totally agree. I have one proposal of a differentiation, arguing that until the mid-1980s, the Freedom Party was a small party of old brown boys, yesterday men, I would call them. And with Haider, this was a transformation, and so the Freedom Party became to some extent an avant-garde of right-wing movement in Europe, but I don't think that we disagree at that point. I didn't want to speak about Italy, but for me, Italy is a disastrous example of a coalition between a left and a right-wing political party. Then, because for the it's very clear for me that this five-star movement came from the very left. Yeah, it was anti-Berlusconi. It became popular in the Berlusconi time. And both parties try to give this gifts to their people. Yeah? And this is a disaster in my view. Yeah? But I want to come back to Shalini's comment. I also would say that there's a deep connection between the crisis of the democratic left parties and the race of the right wing, to some extent to the left wing populist parties. And one can see this, for example, also in the Brexit issue, why the Labour Party is not able to make a strong alternative to the Brexiteers, for example. Yeah? Or that our social democratic party in Austria is not able to develop a realistic and humanitarian alternative to our people with regard to refugees, with regard to migrants, etc. I agree with the differentiation. I think this is very, very important. And the only chance, in my view, a democratic left party would have is to redefine what is a social welfare state under complete different economic and political definition, but on a transnational level. Yeah? Only a European thing. This is a harsh, but on a long run, the only way to fight against right-wing populism. Thank you.
That's good.
There's so much there.
Yes.
So I don't feel that we can come back with comments in response to the discussion.
Yeah, exactly.
Here.
Somebody's got to say something about what's to be done, right?
So we can make what is to be done a theme of these questions. the questions rather than the book.
I can try.
Yeah.
I can try. I don't really have solutions. I will not pretend I have them. But let me mention one or two things from the Polish perspective that you may find interesting. One aspect of the current Polish situation is the absence of the left. There is not a single left party or even left of center party in the Polish parliament. Even the sort of Blairite Social Democrats disappeared from the parliament in 2015. So Polish politics today, well, when it comes to mainstream politics, is all about different shades of the right, which is a very peculiar situation, I have to say. And this whole issue of building an alternative is, as you can imagine, is very much under discussion, but it's a very difficult one. And there, I think, broadly speaking, there are two answers in Poland now. One is you may call it a democratic front. Yeah? So there are people who would say, well, it's a special situation. It's an extraordinary situation. All the democratic forces should unite because democracy as such is under threat. The rule of law, the basic constitutional principles, the freedom of the media, the basic democratic values are under threat, and that requires a special attitude, sort of leaving differences behind in the name of unity. And I can understand that kind of argument. There is another kind of argument that goes like that. There is no return to the liberal democratic system we had. We have to build something completely new. Rebuild the left, rebuild the progressive alternative that may take longer time, but it may have better longer-term results. And as some of you may have heard, just yesterday a new political party was created in Poland by a good friend of mine, Robert Biedroń, and the name of the party is Spring. And the idea is to build a new Spring. The idea is to build a new progressive movement that would be attractive to the new generation in a different way. I wish Robert well, but I think it's a very ambitious undertaking, and I am generally speaking I am full of worries for Polish democracy. I'm not hiding it. There are not many reasons for optimism. I'm afraid because I think the crisis that we face it goes beyond party politics. It's a very deep crisis of democratic culture and democratic values. And I think it's sort of more general breakdown in human empathy, if we can call it that way, which I think is very profound. Just one sentence about Bannon. I'm not an expert on French politics, but I think in this initiative is interesting because, of course, it reflects the phenomenon that you could call internationalization of nationalism, and I think he is finding it more difficult than he expected. But from what I understand, he has a role in building this new sort of alliance with Italy, Hungary, Poland, maybe France, Le Pen. So I think, we should watch out for what happens next on that level. That should be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What I heard about Bannon's influence is that it wasn't so very big, not for the AfD, not for the FPÖ, and also not for the Front National or the Rassemblement National now. So in that way, his appeal doesn't seem to be so enormous, and not ubiquitous. But of course one has to watch out. But his sort of ideology coincides with a lot which is here. Yeah, so it might emphasize, it might sort of contribute to it in that way. What I also would like to say something very briefly on the crisis of the welfare state. I mean, that is why the welfare chauvinism, which I mentioned, is so important in Denmark, Austria, Germany, in these countries which are rich, Switzerland. Switzerland is usually not talked about, but Switzerland had the biggest far-right populist party for a very long time. And is the richest country in the world, or the second richest country in the world after Norway. And in Norway, the far right is also in government. So I think we really need to look at this aspect very strongly, and that is why I mentioned Portugal, because that is so interesting, because they rejected the austerity politics and made it. Now you can say Portugal is small and this, that and the other, and it might not work elsewhere, but what I read about it, and I'm not an expert at all on Portugal, but what I read about it is that the Germans, especially Schäuble, was pressing very hard, that everybody said this government will collapse after half a year, and they didn't. Yeah? So it's very much about finding a new narrative and also a new vision. And in that way, I think, I've been thinking about an alternative narrative for some time, and I came up with a title which I like quite well, which is, instead of basically having this narrative that we should go back retro, make America great again, to something white, Christian, Dada, we should have back to the future. So we should turn around and look in the future and find something for this diverse future. There needs to be a positive narrative, but a complex one. It can't be simplistic. And it should not only be for the conservative right, but also for the center left. I mean, just I think the class society as such doesn't exist that way anymore. We have a much stronger emphasis on values, and that has to be addressed. So if you think about the big challenges which are not talked about, like climate change, all these big challenges can only be coped with internationally and together. So there has to be a new narrative emphasizing the other challenges and not just migration and so forth, and the way that everybody needs everybody to cope with it. I mean, all the migrants are actually paying into the pot. It's not like they come here, especially migrants, pay taxes. So they are part and parcel, and I was thinking, having been in London now for a week, I thought London would collapse if migrants would have to leave. No more restaurants, no more hospitals, no more universities. I don't know. I mean, 50% of London's population would leave. So you need to make this concrete and also try and formulate, and I think this is not easy, but it has to be also a good narrative which is emotional. The left has frequently been much too instrumental and rational in its language. Not so. I mean, there are many emotions. Solidarity has always been an emotional issue, but instead of just addressing fear and destruction and apocalyptic images, you have to address, I think one has to address other emotions within contextualized.
Zoe.
Sorry. I didn't know. I'm not thinking. I've stopped thinking. But no, I was thinking about this point about the collapse of the welfare state and how that, and not the anti-immigrant language, was at the root of it. And I think I'm probably going to land ultimately with your transnational benefit, agreeing with that, but coming at it from a different direction. I don't know enough about the European context, but I know that in the UK context, that period of the rescinding the social state and basically cutting benefit recipients off at the knee, was marked by extreme violence of language against welfare recipients. Yeah. And I was thinking about you saying the state media calling people traitors who didn't agree. In England, we don't have state-controlled media. Rather, we have a media-controlled state. So you have this very violent press calling people traitors regularly, and then the politics responding to them. It's a bit like how British politicians are very hard to corrupt, because you can basically corrupt them for the price of a Kit Kat. So it's impossible to detect. If somebody doesn't need very much money, then it's impossible to detect where the corruption has come from, but the corruption is nevertheless there. Sorry, that was a diversion. There was a period from before 2010, actually, of extremely violent language against benefit recipients and anybody in receipt of kind of the social state. And I think what it did was it made people feel that their citizenship was contested, and then it was very easy from there to make them respond angrily to immigrants, because if your citizenship is uncontested, then of course immigrants aren't a problem. But if you are only by your fingertips considered a thing of value to your own nation, then anybody coming in, being told that immigrants are not net recipients, pay more tax than they receive, keep the health service afloat, that doesn't cut any ice with you at all, because you're dealing with your own position in your own country being infinitely contested, and your own value being infinitely, act of violence really against the sense of your value as a citizen in your nation. So I think, in a way, the thing to rediscover in the language on the left is that Lakoff idea of a nation's wealth being indivisible from a nation's people, of the people being the resource of the nation. Because I think if we have better resilience against segments of the population being victimized, then we would have better resilience against the right then instrumentalizing that sense of victimhood. Ultimately, you kind of ironically, you get back to Ursula Hirschman's point about the foundations of the EU, that actually the point of a kind of non-bordered identity, citizenly identity and political identity is that only a nation can repudiate you. Only a nation can say you no longer belong here because you're not productive enough, or you're not healthy enough, or you're not white enough, or you're not pure enough. Only a bordered nation can do that to you. Across borders, these decisions are made collectively, and nobody can eject you. So I think if you were kind of trying to remake a sense of citizenship as something that couldn't be taken away from you, you would land naturally at a kind of cross-bordered set of solutions.
I wanted to come back to this question of Putin and Bannon, because I think in some ways they're similar questions. They're both about how European societies are being in some ways penetrated by what's happening elsewhere, and this new nationalist internationalism that we see. I mean, for me, in a way, I think this is one of the points of continuity between the old nationalism and the old fascism and the new nationalism, because the old fascism was also networked and highly integrated and had common conferences together and built international diplomatic alliances and so on, and the new nationalism is as well. One of the lesser known examples that I like to mention occasionally is the case of the American President Warren Harding, who came from the state of Ohio and was president from 21 to 23, and he is often credited, and it probably was said somewhere else beforehand, but often associated with the slogan America First. And what was interesting about his sort of history and legacy in a way is that there were lots and lots of German immigrants in Ohio and Pennsylvania at the time. And lots of them provided the bedrock and would provide the bedrock for the appeasement movement towards Hitler in the 1930s. And I think it brings to light the really messy way that sort of communication and geopolitics get messed up together. I think one of the things you see with the new far right, that again the same as the old far right, the further along you go on the spectrum of extremism, the more that race comes to trump nation. So a good example of this, someone who's become much more prominent in recent years is Richard Spencer in the United States. I mean, he describes himself as a revolutionary nationalist, a revolutionary Nazi, and interestingly enough, he rejects American nationalism and promotes a white settler state in the territory of North America that would become a homeland for white people fleeing a Muslim Europe, essentially. So race comes to trump nation for him. And then on the question of what do we do, and I think a couple of questions. You said, you know, we need in a way we need the centre right, or embracing its liberal values again. And I'm not of the centre right, as you can tell, perhaps, but I fully support this. I mean, I just would express disappointment with the centre right's current ability to do this and its orientation to do this. I mean, Orban is still a member of the European People's Party. I mean, in my own country, in the UK, I mean, the most one-nation Conservatives, I would say, are the Scottish Conservative MPs. And ask yourself, where of the Scottish MPs, given Scotland voted overwhelmingly against Brexit, where have they been in the Brexit debate? And they're missing in action, I'm afraid. They're not prepared to stand up and promote it. And one of the things, I've been shocked a lot of times over the last few years about what's happened in Britain, but I mean, last week in the House of Commons, there was a vote that was purely symbolic. So it didn't actually mean anything. The amendment that was being voted on even said this doesn't mean anything and it doesn't bind the government to do anything. But a vote against no deal was passed by 8 votes. And it didn't bind the government to do it. And one of the things that has left me incredibly frustrated with the discussion in Britain about Brexit and no deal is that it's all about the economic consequences. And for me, the most dangerous thing about this support for no deal isn't really about the economic consequences, although they're clearly very severe. It's the mentality that is animating the vote. So when 42% of your population is prepared to say we should break our international alliances, refuse to pay them all the money that we've committed to pay them in the past, I'm afraid this is an increasingly fascistic mentality. It's tearing up the basis for the legal order in Europe. It's that dangerous. And so in that context, I think we do need an alliance of all Democrats to protect the democratic order in Europe, and that has to embrace everyone that wants to support, you know, democracy and the rule of law and everything. And so, I feel that we've run out of time, but I just wanted to also thank all of our participants and guests on the podcasts, and thanks to the Institute of Human Sciences for hosting, and thanks for you to attending. And please, you know, remain as engaged as you are in this conversation and activity around it, because I just think it's, you know, such a hugely important moment that Europe is in, you know, currently, and we have to work together. And thank you to Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for supporting tonight's event. Thanks.